All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Suzanne Seitz. I'm the genetic counselor here at Fairfax Cryobank. This session is being recorded. This afternoon, we're going to be emailing a copy of this presentation to everyone who's registered. And if you do need to drop off before the end, you'll still be getting the complete recording from beginning to end. It should take about an hour. The first 30 minutes or so will be the presentation, and the last 30 minutes we have an open Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, the best way to do that is to go into the chat icon on the panel there in this webinar, type in the question, and then you'll be able to ask, we'll read out the questions in that last 30-minute section. Let me tell you who's with us today. So you've got me, Suzanne Seitz. I've been a genetic counselor here for almost 20 years, working at the sperm bank, working in the parent company for over 30 years. Doreen is with us from Client Services. She's one of our managers there. She's very good at answering all those incredibly important questions about getting a donor purchased, getting the vials purchased and shipped, and all those logistics that are involved with that. And then we have Morgan, who's our senior marketing manager, who's going to be moderating the questions at the end. So let me introduce you to our genetics team. It's myself and my medical director, Harvey Stern, who has been here a very long time. He's a pediatric geneticist, so he is an absolute expert when it comes to anything genetic. He does all the donor screenings. He is very, very familiar with all the testing. So he is a wonderful resource for us here. Brian Mariani is our director of molecular genetics. We do a lot of our own genetic testing in-house. We have an IVF lab. We do embryo testing. So we have very sophisticated genetic test technology here under one roof, which is a huge advantage for us. Dr. Joseph Schulman was our original founder. He is also a geneticist and an OBGYN, and started our IVF clinic here all those years ago, back in the 1980s. And Nadine is our most recent addition. She is our genetic assistant. She's also a member of our client services team, and she may be someone that you speak to when you're asking those first initial questions about genetic suitability, but she's a wonderful addition to our team. So the goals today are for me to explain to you what it means to be a carrier. I want to talk to you about the type of testing that is done on the Fairfax Cryobank donors. And I want to help you navigate the donor search so that you can find that ideal donor match for you. And then, of course, we'll have the Q&A session at the end. We started doing these expanded genetic carrier tests back in January of 2018. Basically, that means that we're testing for now hundreds of diseases. And obviously, for the last 5 years, all of our new donors have been tested on those panels. We do have donors that are still for sale that were tested prior to January 2018, and there are about 100 of those that are still on our donor search, but the majority of our donors have had this expanded panel testing done. The initial panel was 283. That has now increased to over 500, and I anticipate as the years go on, we'll continue to add big chunks of more genes onto the testing. 10 years from now, we'll be testing for thousands of genes. We offer the testing by gene sequencing. So it is the latest and greatest technology with the highest detection rate. That technology has evolved over the years as well. So it's amazing how quickly this technology is getting better and better as every year goes by. And that final point, negative result for a gene reduces the risk to be a carrier significantly. When you get a negative result on a test for a specific gene, you reduce risk. You don't eliminate risk. And that's an important distinction here. So our goal here isn't to make the risk zero, because that's not actually possible, but we want to take any situation that has the potential of being high risk and bring that risk as far down to zero as possible. Now I'm going to take you back to Biology 101. The types of genetic conditions that we are screening the donors for on these big multi-hundred gene panels are autosomal recessive. Autosomal recessive means that if we carry a gene with a variant in it that breaks one copy of a gene, we do have a complementary copy of that gene that is working correctly. So one of our genes has a variant. We partner with someone who has a variant in the same gene. Now we're both carriers for the same gene. These are the outcomes that are possible in our children. We could have a child that inherits the two normal copies. That's 25% of the time. 50% of the time, our children will be carriers like we are. And 25% of the time, there is the chance for an affected offspring for whatever condition that gene transcribes for. So it's important to remember we're talking about people with identical genes, carrier status in identical genes. When we do this expanded panel testing, what's your chance of being a carrier? You know, the more we test for, the more likely it is we're going to find that you're a carrier for something. Now we're approaching 85–90% of the results are going to show that you're a carrier for at least one gene on the panel. Theoretically, if we test for all 20,000 genes that we as humans have within us, we anticipate that we'll be carriers for a handful of genes, all of us. Right now, we can only detect some of those. What's the chance that both the biological parents, the egg source and the sperm source, are carriers for the same gene? It's going to be less than 1%. But that is the group that we're trying to identify so that we can reduce the risk for an affected child. Because if we're both carriers for the same gene, now our risk goes from very small to 25%. This is why we do this testing, is to identify the egg and sperm source couples that are both carriers for the same gene and now have this 25% risk. So how do we reduce our risks? Well, if you find that you're a carrier for a specific gene, you're in good company, you know, we're carriers, you just now know what you're a carrier of, it's going to be very important that the donor is tested and negative. If the donor is a carrier for a specific gene, in reverse, it's going to be very important that you be tested and negative. So it goes both ways. If we identify that one of you is a carrier, we just simply have to make sure that the other parent or biological parent is tested and negative. So if you're a carrier, you can look at donors that are already tested negative for the gene that you carry. And I'm going to show you real time how you can do that step by step on our donor search. If you've not been tested, now there are a certain group of women that have the ability to find a donor that has had all this extensive testing. And if that answer is good for you, you may not need to be tested. But ideally, before you start the search, it's best to complete all the genetic testing that you want to have done so that you have that result in hand when you're searching our site. If you need to go back and do additional testing, you're adding several weeks onto the process. So the more information you have, the better. We do have between 100 and 150 donors that are not carriers on the site. They typically are donors that did not have the expanded panel testing, but we do have that 15% of donors with the expanded panel testing that were all negative. But most of them are simply going to be donors that had fewer tests done prior to 2018. But if you like a donor who is a carrier, you could then ask your clinic to help you get tested for that gene, find out you're negative, and then be able to use that donor. All right, now I'm going to show you, we're going to do a demonstration here. So when you go to the donor search, you'll see multiple different categories for what you can look for to find that ideal donor. Now, the first section is going to be more about ancestry and hair color, eye color education. The section that I want to talk to you about is the genetic testing search. So if you pick any, you're going to see the donor, all the donors on the list. If you look at expanded panel tested donors, you're going to find the donors with the additional testing. You can also select the donors that are all negative, but remember, that's going to be a much smaller group of donors. You can also select a donor by tested negative by condition name. So if you're looking at your result and you know that you're a carrier, you can look at this list by condition name. It's alphabetized. I discourage you from using this sorting mechanism because different labs will call the same condition different names. The common denominator is going to be the gene name, which are these series of letters and numbers that follow the condition name. So I'm going to encourage you to use select by gene. So if you want a donor that is negative for a gene ATRX, and you're going to be looking at your genetic results and you're going to be looking for that gene name, you can then add that. You can apply that to your search criteria. So here I have picked one condition, but let's say I'm also interested in a Black donor that is negative for that condition. So now I'm bringing that search down to a smaller number. That number happened to be 0. So let me try a different search here. So let's pick a Black donor that is negative for let's pick GJB2. Where are you? Let's pick that. And let's search. And we're going to find 4 donors. So now you can see that you've picked something that matters to you as far as what the donor is going to look like to you, but he's also meeting your criteria that he's negative for a specific gene that you tested positive for. Now, if you end up in a situation like when I did the first search where the gene you're a carrier for, you don't get any results, do know that we have the option to do special testing on a donor for that gene. It does add an additional 4 to 6 weeks on to your ability to ship that donor vial to your clinic. And of course, it has to be negative before we process that shipment. We don't want you to ship a vial, then do the testing, find out he's positive. Now you have a vial you can't use, and we're not able to get that vial back and provide you a refund. If you leave the vial with us while that testing is being done, you keep all your options available. If he's positive, we give you a full refund for that vial price, and then we can go and find you another donor to do that testing. I wanted to show you a specific donor here and kind of go over what the different parts of his profile look like, specifically about the genetic testing. You're going to see on an individual donor page all these different things that you can download. Here on genetic testing, you're going to be able to open up all the genetic testing he's had done. So let me show that to you here. So his genetic testing is going to have a face sheet. It's going to show you the date that this genetic testing summary was created or last touched. I create these. This date will likely be several months beyond when the actual testing was performed because the donors are having their testing while they're in the screening process. Those vials have to be in quarantine for another 6 months. So these genetic testing summaries are being created several months after the testing was actually done. This donor here has an ancestry here. Why do I put the ancestry here? Because different ethnicities, ancestries, races have different risks for the different genes. So there are some conditions that are more common in Caucasians, some that are more common in African Americans, some that are more common in Asians. And so when we as genetic counselors are evaluating risk, we often are asking, what is the ethnicity of the different biological parents? So this is just added as extra information to help establish risk. Now, these are the basic 3 tests that we're doing on all of our donors. Every donor has a chromosome analysis done. Every donor has a hemoglobin evaluation done. And I'm going to show you what those actual reports look like after I show you what their expanded panel testing results look like. So here's a donor who had the 502 panel, We're going to tell you how many genes he was tested for on the front sheet. And here in red, always in red, you will know if a donor is a carrier. He is a carrier for biotinidase deficiency. And within the parentheses here, you see BTD. That is the gene name. So when we're talking to you about what you're a carrier for, you can give us condition name, but in some cases, it's just really easier to tell us the gene name because like I said, that is the common denominator and it makes it much easier to search for that. You're going to follow that front sheet with his actual testing results. So you'll see the biotinidase deficiency is listed here. And biotinidase deficiency is listed here. If you want to know more about the condition, then the important thing to do is stay on this result. And here, the reports will give you very simple discussion of what that condition is about. You don't need to call us to find out what he's a carrier for because it's right there on the report. And I'm always very pleased with how they've simplified the language so you don't need to have a PhD to understand what that condition is about. I will say uniformly genetic conditions tend to be relatively serious. Some have treatment, but that is rare. Biotinidase deficiency is one that actually does have an effective treatment, but it is lifelong and daily. So these are not low burden diseases. So it is, if you want to know more about the condition, you can read about it there. If you go further, these testing results are pages and pages long. Now you're finding out all the different genes and conditions he was tested for. And this is where you could look yourself to see if he was tested negative. But more importantly, you can use that genetic filter to do the work for you. Now, one concept here that I wanted you to understand is this residual risk. So when we test a donor or yourself and you get a negative result, we don't say your risk is zero. I had mentioned that earlier, that there is this reduced risk, this residual risk. So these numbers that are on the genetic testing summary tell you what the leftover risk is to still be a carrier with a negative result. So these numbers all vary, they're all different. And the reason for that is that genes have different frequencies in the population. Some of them are common and some of them are exceptionally rare. So that's an important concept to understand. In addition, the genetic testing, some of it has very high detection rates, 99% of the variants that we expect to be there can be found. Some of them have a lower detection rate, maybe 85% of the variants can be found. But when they do all the math, they come up with this number. It is also done in consideration of the ethnicity. So some ethnicities will have a lower risk here, some will have a higher risk. Again, that's all based on the science. So if you find that let's say you're a carrier for, I wanted to use OPA3. So you're a carrier for OPA3. He has tested negative reduced risk. His chance to be a carrier is 1 in 50,000. You are a carrier. So what is the chance of an affected child? It's not zero, but it's 1 in 200,000. So that is the risk that you enter into a conception with for that particular gene. Now, if we didn't do the testing on him and he wasn't negative, let's say he had not been tested, there's going to be a chance that he's a carrier, and it's certainly going to be much higher than 1 in 50,000. Let's say it's 1 in 100. So you can see by doing the testing and having it be negative, we're going to reduce the risk as close to zero as possible for your child. So you're going to see pages and pages of genes that he was tested for. Now I'm going to show you the other testing that was done that I mentioned earlier. So we had a chromosome analysis done. So a chromosome analysis, again, going back to your Bio 101, we're looking at the whole genetic structures here called chromosomes. We want to find 46. The X and the Y determine gender here. He's a male. Our chromosomes occur in pairs, and we want to make sure all these bands are exactly where they're supposed to be. The reason we do a chromosome analysis is because if we find that there is a rearrangement of these chromosomes, part is broken off and attached somewhere else, he's going to be healthy, but his sperm have the potential of being unbalanced. And when you have too much or too little genetic material in a gamete, an egg or a sperm, now they can create conceptions that are unbalanced, and it will highly likely result in miscarriage. We're trying to avoid that. Clearly, we're trying to avoid that. There's also the chance that that child could be live born and have very significant genetic issues. So we exclude any donor that has an abnormal chromosome analysis. And so we routinely do it as a way of screening and knowing that only the normal donors are allowed to proceed in the program. So here is the other test we have done. It's called a hemoglobin electrophoresis or hemoglobinopathy panel. And we're just looking at common red blood cell markers. This is not a DNA test, but it could pick up anemia, for instance, but it's also going to pick up people that are increased risk for common genetic conditions, specifically sickle cell disease, alpha thalassemia, beta thalassemia. So often this is a routine test that is just done for wellness in general, but this is an important test for us for screening. All right, so I wanted to also show you, let's go back to here. So we've done the genetic test. So that's how you can take a look at the genetic testing. Now, one thing I should have mentioned is that when a donor has an expanded panel, he's going to have this highlighted banner. The donors that do not have this banner have not had expanded panel testing. So that's a good way for you to know as you're sorting through the donors whether or not they've had the expanded panel testing done. If the donor is a carrier for genetic condition, you're going to see this acknowledgement of genetic risk download. A donor that is not a carrier will not have this. So that's also important for you to know. You will need to complete this, initial it. It can be done as a DocuSign online, which makes it much easier. But this will need to be completed and returned to us before you'll be able to purchase this donor. So it is important for you to review it and understand the different items in there. And I'm going to show you that now. So the acknowledgement of genetic risk will reintroduce you to the donor and the specific condition he's a carrier for. We want you to be able to discuss these results with your doctor before using the donor. We want you to know that if you've been tested and neither of you are carriers for the condition, the risk is low or almost zero. But importantly here in bold, if you are both carriers for the same gene or the same recessive condition, now you're at increased risk. And if you recall from my earlier discussion, that risk is 25%. This is a situation we want to avoid. We make you initial because it's really important for you to understand that if he's a carrier and you're a carrier for the same gene, now we have a 25% risk. We encourage you to seek genetic counseling. Doctors will often have a referral source through their office. Even if they don't have a genetic counselor on site, they will use a referral service. You could also use the service that's part of your genetic testing laboratory. If you have an expanded panel test done, often the genetic counseling is complimentary so that you can review your results with them, and you can often bring your sperm donor's genetic results to them and they can do an assessment for you. I'm also available to help do what we call a suitability match, so you can always use me as a resource as well. Now, this is an important concept to understand. There is a refund option, so you can purchase the vials and you have up to 45 days to make sure all the logistics work for you. If your physician isn't able to respond to you in a timely way, or you're worried about vial availability because these vials are selling out quickly, you can go ahead and purchase knowing that you have 45 days to make sure that this works for you. Within those 45 days, if you find out it's not a good match, you have the ability to get a full refund for those vials or get a credit to use towards the purchase of a different donor. And if there are any fees associated with that, we've waived them. So we want you to be able to get the donor you like when you find them, and then we can work through the logistics with you. Ideally, we'd like all of that in place before you actually purchase the vials, but when inventory numbers are low, we don't want you to miss out because you have to wait several days to get all your questions answered. We then ask you to sign, give us your home address and date of birth. Once we have this on file, we'll be able to, and it just goes into our inbox, we'll be able to complete the purchase of those vials. So let me go back here. So here, let's kind of walk through this again. Go, new search. So let's say you now have had carrier screening done. You know you're a carrier for a specific gene, and you want to see who's available for you to look at. Let's just not put any other criteria in. There are 129 donors with that specific criteria that all have available vials. If that number is too high for you, you can continue to add criteria in to get that number lower. Going through these profiles is a big process. If you were to review a profile from beginning to end, it could take you up to an hour if you listen to the audio and read all the information that's available on these donors. So trying to get this number as low as possible works for you. I would suggest using that gene filter because you don't want, if you know you're a carrier, because otherwise you could find a donor you really like and he hasn't been tested when there were donors tested that you could have looked at first. So if that gene is on that selection panel, definitely use it before you make a final selection. Now, I did want to emphasize too that if we haven't done the gene that you're positive for on any of our donors, we do have that special testing option available, and we will work through that with you, but that will extend the timeline up to 6 weeks before we can ship that vial out to your clinic. And keep that in mind if you're trying to schedule a cycle. There's also a fee involved in that, and if we can find you a donor that's already tested negative, we're obviously going to want to do that. All right, I need to go back to my presentation. Where is it?
Oh, it's in your web.
I close it?
Mm-hmm.
I closed it?
You might have, sorry guys, one sec. Is it here?
No. I'm gonna have to,
1 second, everyone.
Okay. Let's go back to the. See, this is why we're worried. This is what I was worried. All right, sorry about that. I got a little trigger happy and closed the screen. So, so if you found the donor you want, it's important as a new client for you to complete a terms of use. That is our agreement with you, what you need to understand we will promise to you, and you need to have that completed before your first purchase. If you are choosing a carrier donor, you need to complete that acknowledgement of genetic risk form as well. Then is a good time for you to either order the vials online, or if you're a first-time purchaser, we really encourage you to call client services to place that first order. And obviously their phone number is there on the screen. You can order the vials online, but you'll need a lot of information to complete the order. You'll need to know the name of your clinic, the address of your clinic, and when you want those vials to arrive. There's a shipping options. It can be a little challenging if you've never done it before. But once you've purchased once through client services by doing a phone order, it's much easier to go back online, and if you need more vials, purchase them the next time online. So just to summarize, it is important for all of us to know that being a genetic carrier is normal. And if you are a carrier, we have to make sure that the donor is negative. And that's the way we reduce the risk for your child. And in reverse, if the donor's a carrier, you're negative. We want to use the donor search to find that donor. That's a good genetic match for you. If you have any questions about whether or not you've done it right and that you've figured out that the donor looks like he's a good match, that the testing was right, you can still reach out to client services. And if you have your expanded panel testing results, you can share those with us. Let us know what donor numbers you're interested in or which donor you're interested in, and we can give it a thumbs up. Nadine and I are both able to do those suitability matches for you pretty quickly. And now, once you find that ideal donor, you know the steps to take to complete that order. We do have a promo that's going on, a promotional code, Genetics 2023, where you can get a free unlimited access plan, which allows you to see all the different donor products for one price for all the donors. You don't have to buy it a la carte. And that's available through the end of the month. And now I guess we're going to start the Q&A if anybody has any questions. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Please continue putting your questions into the chat box. We'll get to them as we're able. So the first one that came in is someone said that I am Latina ancestry. I have a positive CMV. Can I get a donor who is also CMV positive, or does it have to be CMV negative for the donor?
So she's positive.
Correct.
So CMV is not a genetic condition. It's not inherited. CMV is a virus that we catch like the flu. And once we are CMV positive, that means we've had a past infection and that we have an antibody for that flu. So we won't catch it again because we have those antibodies in our system. So if you're CMV positive, you have the antibody, you can use any donor on our site, positive or negative. Donors on our site that are CMV positive are not considered contagious. These are donors that also just have an antibody from a past infection. The reverse is not necessarily true. So if you are CMV negative, your clinic may have a very rigid policy about what type of donor you can use. They may say you can only use CMV negative donors. If you are negative, it means you have not had an exposure that resulted in you creating antibodies, which means you're vulnerable to an infection. CMV is a concern when you are pregnant. If you contract CMV and you are near term in particular, your baby could be born with CMV. And although we as adults just tend to get flu-like symptoms, babies can be very seriously affected and really struggle with that condition. So we really want to avoid having pregnant women be exposed and catch CMV while they're pregnant. It is highly unlikely that you would contract CMV from an insemination. It's so early in the process. Also, our donors are tested rigorously every 3 months, have to be negative on the contagion, that they're negative for being contagious. But some clinics have a very rigid policy that they don't want to take any risks and therefore only allow you to use CMV negative donors. And just to complete that question, if you are doing IVF, that semen is actually never touching you. So many IVF clinics will allow you to use both positive or negative donors because the semen isn't actually coming in contact with you. But for insemination, they may have a rigid policy. You do need to check with your doctor about that and let them tell you what they want you to do.
And then we got a question about blood type as well and the importance of choosing a donor of a certain blood type. Can you explain that again?
So this is a situation where certain blood types put you at higher risk for complications in pregnancy, in the sense that if you are Rh negative, remember you have A, B, or O, and that's one side of the coin, but the other side is whether or not you're Rh positive or negative. If you're Rh negative and you have a pregnancy that is positive, your body will recognize that pregnancy as almost like an infection and create an immune response to it. That can be a problem for the pregnancy and can really cause some complications. So if you are negative, they will often recommend that you only use a sperm source that is also negative, so that you will only have negative conceptions. If you and the baby are both negative, you won't have that immune response, and the pregnancy won't have complications from that. There is a treatment called RhoGAM, which is an injection that is done during the pregnancy, but this is something that needs to be planned out ahead very carefully. Obviously, you don't want to change out, sperm donors can be changed very quickly, but obviously if your partner is definitely a different blood type than you, there are ways to make that work so that you can have a successful pregnancy, but it does require some planning.
What are your recommendations to find a donor if your genetic condition isn't listed in the donor search? And she mentions, for example, BRCA2, BRCA2.
Right, so BRCA1 and 2 are cancer genes, and we exclusively test for pediatric onset serious genetic conditions. And these cancer genes are considered adult onset dominant conditions. So someone that carries the mutation has a 50% chance of passing it on to their child. So we actually do not test our donors for dominant conditions. So if, for instance, you carry BRCA, you could have the embryo tested for the variant that is inherited from you, and then exclude the embryos that are positive for the BRCA gene. BRCA is a dominant, so only one copy of the variant needs to be present in order for the condition to be at increased risk for the condition. In BRCA, about 80 to 90% of people that carry the variant will develop cancer at some point in their life. So that is an important gene to know about. In BRCA, you would want to look at the donor's family history to make sure there aren't any first or second degree relatives with early onset cancer. You would likely see that in his history if he had BRCA, and we certainly would exclude donors that have a clustering of cancer in the family. So it's one of the things Dr. Stern and I do is look at those family histories to reduce the risk for those kinds of issues. But if we're talking about a gene that is a recessive gene and it isn't on that panel for you to choose from in the selection filter, then find a donor that you like and then reach out to us and we'll see if we can get that testing done. We have the ability to send DNA from a donor to a laboratory and get a result in about 4 to 6 weeks. But you do need to talk to us about it because there are some genes that are easy to get and some that are either much more complicated or just not feasible. So definitely reach out to us. You would be talking to me or Nadine about those special testing requests.
If the mother is not a carrier for any conditions, but the donor is, what is the % chance that the child will have that condition?
So she's not a carrier and he is.
Correct.
So, so this is where that residual risk comes into play, and it matters which gene we're talking about. So I would need to, I can do that calculation for you if you're interested in the actual numbers. Each gene will have a different risk for an affected child based on how common that gene is in the general population. But we started off in a good place because one is positive and the other is tested and negative. So now he has a residual risk. She's a carrier, and we can do the calculation, but it's likely going to be pretty close to zero for those. So that's what you want. If one's a carrier, the other is tested and negative, that's a green light, that's good to go.
And I guess the flip side, if the donor is clear of all genetic risk, should the person receiving the donor sperm still be tested?
That's one situation where you could actually forego carrier screening. If you choose a donor that's all negative on the expanded panel testing, now granted, those donors do sell out very quickly and have long notification lists because of exactly this reason. It makes it easier for you not to have to go through testing. But if you were able to acquire a vial of a donor that's all negative on expanded panel testing, you would not need to be tested. Now, if you choose a different donor later on, you may find that not having your own carrier screening done, it's going to slow things up as you try and catch up to what a new donor may require you to be tested for. It's, the other thing to remember is that panels are different. So where Semaphore was a lab that was available to us last year, they subsequently stopped doing this type of carrier testing, and their panels are no longer available. And every lab out there has a different panel with different genes. Now there's a pretty big overlap on the genes on those panels, but it's not uncommon for you to be tested at a different lab than the donor. You cannot assume that those gene lists are the same. We actually have to physically look and make sure that if one is positive, the other is actually tested and negative, because the panels are not the same across laboratories.
Okay, the next question is, I'm using an egg donor as well. Can I choose a bile from a carrier donor, and after the egg donor go through the genetic testing here in Canada, and we identify that they are also a carrier, can I change or return the vial, assuming it has not shipped yet?
Yes, and that is exactly what we want you to do. We want you to be able to have the time to get that testing completed. We do not want you to use a donor or feel obligated to keep a donor that you cannot use. So if you undergo the screening in the egg source and it's positive for the same gene that the sperm source is a carrier for, you have to get rid of one of them. You either exchange the egg donor or you exchange the sperm donor. But absolutely, you can get a refund. Don't ship the vial. That allows that option to stay available to you.
The next question is for Doreen. If the donor is in the waiting list, how long do I need to wait? Would it be possible for you guys to say approximately when the sperm would be available?
So it's hard to say a little bit when sperm is going to be available. It's really dependent on when it's going to be cleared from the quarantine period and if the donor is still actively participating in our program or not. What we're waiting for is when a donor makes a deposit, there's an FDA regulated 6-month quarantine period before the vials are able to be sold. So sometimes donors have vials available, and sometimes they don't have anything because all the vials that they have available or that are going to be available are just pending to be released from that quarantine. So we can give you an estimate. We can't really guarantee anything. If that infectious disease testing comes back as positive, we wouldn't be able to sell those vials.
That's one reason we ask you to have a couple of donors chosen that meet your criteria. So that always gives you a plan B or a second option donor, especially if you're trying to stay on a timeline for trying to do a cycle in a month or two. You can wait as long as you can for that first choice donor to release vials, but if that doesn't happen, at least you have a backup plan. It is hard to pick a donor quickly. We know that. We know it can take a long time. We did a survey and found that it took several weeks, if not a whole month, for someone to make a final choice. And so if you always keep a couple of donors in mind, that would be helpful for you if you find that you can't wait anymore for those vials to release.
Are things like personality inherited?
Well, we get this question a lot. I think about it this way. We're kind of wired to be introverted or extroverted, high energy, low energy, and we consider that personality traits, but it's also part of our nervous system. And I think components of our nervous system are inherited, but it's clearly not 100%. So, if you have an extroverted parent, it doesn't mean that your child is extroverted necessarily, because we see that in our own lives, that there can be tremendous differences even within families. So there is a component to personality that is heritable, but which component will shine from the list is hard to determine. Also, we have the nature versus nurture. So you have people that are, in a certain environment, and it's going to allow them to, they're going to be raised in an environment that may be very different and encourage different personality traits. So I do think that there is some heritability there, but we can't say for sure that just because you have an extroverted donor, you'll have an extroverted child. We do give you the personality testing results more as a way for you to see you know, how this donor is wired so that you can decide if he's likable to you or not.
All right, and then we have time for one more question. Does Fairfax Cryobank offer genetic testing kits for purchase?
We actually don't do the genetic testing for our clients. It really does need to be ordered through the physician that you are being cared for by. Now, having said that, there is a direct-to-consumer testing lab that will allow you to order the testing kit and have it shipped to your home. And that is Invitae, INVITAE.com. They are actually our new genetic testing provider. We don't have any donors yet with released vials with that testing, but we started doing that testing a few months ago, and it's a very reputable lab, and they will offer direct-to-consumer carrier testing. You can go online, order the kit. They do participate with insurance. If you don't have insurance, the maximum fee they would charge you for the expanded panel testing is $250. And in addition, they have a whole group of genetic counselors available to discuss your results with you when they come back. They offer lots of different panels, not just these reproductive panels prior to pregnancy. They're a big genetic testing company. So I highly recommend you consider doing direct-to-consumer testing online. But you do want to loop in your healthcare provider if you can, so because they're going to need to have access to those results as they make sure that any sperm source that you use is compatible. If they have resources on site to do that matching, you know, they're going to need to see those results. These are usually digital results that come back to you with full explanations, and so you'll just have to be able to pass that information either on to us if you want us to do the matching or your clinic. So it sounds like we've got most of the questions answered at this point. We want to thank you for joining us. Remember our promo code, Genetics 2023, that's valid till the end of the month, and you do get that free access to all the donor information. And thank you. And again, we'll be sending this out by email at the end of the day, and anyone that signed up, even if you didn't participate, today will get a copy, or if you had to drop out early. And definitely reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.